introduction. And yes, and thanks indeed again to my various excavation partners over the years, Ian Kite at DRA, Mohammed Najjar and Steve Mython at WF16, and Cheryl and Mohammed Najjar at Beta, and Cheryl at Sharara, and so on. And of course, thanks also to the Department of Antiquities in Jordan, who've made the whole thing possible. So what I thought I'd try and do today is apply some of my thoughts I've had over the last few years on Neolithic belief systems and try to explore what lies behind the patterns of behavior we see mostly in the early Neolithic, and as you'll realize from my excavation history, mostly in Jordan. I may roam out of Jordan occasionally. And of course, as it's about beliefs, some of you may well find this a bit of a work of fantasy or fiction, but I'm going to try and explain both why I think this is necessary as well as what we can do. And I'm going to advance the slide, so tell me if that works or not. It's not working for me. Yes, good. And you're all familiar with these images of plastered skulls, originally found by Kenyon at Jericho, which have become such an iconic symbol of the Neolithic and a significant part of how we understand burial practices and ritual in the Neolithic, even if the plastered skulls themselves are a relatively brief and geographically restricted phenomenon. Their discovery opened up a whole discussion of ancestor worship, family lineages and households and so on, and their association, often with early Neolithic architecture, connected these ideas to sedentism and property, all in all encompassing much of what we see as the Neolithic and the Neolithic Revolution and so on. Now, since those early days, debate on Neolithic mortuary practices developed considerably, and the range of evidence expanded has developed. But the dead are still generally seen as objects being deployed to fulfill the needs of the living. Neolithic mortuary practices in Southwest Asia are generally interpreted as a key component of new social systems designed to provide mechanisms to hold increasingly large communities together, control social conflict, and variously maintain egalitarian systems or reinforce emergent lineages. There's a lot hanging on them, basically. And I'm going to propose today that treatment of the dead arose from early Neolithic belief systems, where they continued to have much more active agency and less individuality than we might immediately think. And that has implications for how we understand how they're used. Now, there was a spate of books about a decade ago on mortuary archaeology in the Neolithic of Southwest Asia, recognizing its importance in general. But the books are also a tacit recognition that mortuary archaeology is often taken somewhat out of context. And today I'm going to take a little diversion away from mortuary practices and look at other forms of evidence as well, not only to give and include context, but also to see if the belief systems we can try to discover in mortuary practice can be seen elsewhere. After all, the whole point of belief systems is that they should imbue everything that happens. Now, Ian Kite has led the field on the interpretation of complex sequential patterns of mortuary practice, where the patterns of ritual are understood as methods of organizing increasingly complex societies and reinforcing social norms, while the practices themselves inform us of the living society, whether in terms of hierarchy or those practices. And he's noted in his arguments a number of key features and the way that the operation goes around in this fashion, from the original burial to the removal of the skulls, painting and plastering of skulls, and then you can use that to schedule larger celebrations before the reburial of the skulls. So you have this sort of schedulable process, and he talks about the meaning this may have to society. But one of the key points, or to me, one of the key points he raises, is that within this system, for it to have any success or efficacy, participants and observers must be aware of the broader meanings and messages present, as well as the broader belief systems they represent. And he goes on to say, while it's not possible for us to directly interpret the spiritual beliefs, it's possible to reflect upon why such ritualized beliefs were standardized. Now, I think where I disagree with Ian here is that I don't think we can accept the case that the belief system is too difficult to understand. I think if we accept it's what gives symbolism its meaning, we've got to try and look at it, at least to try and approach how these belief systems work, or our stories about the meaning of mortuary rituals will remain cut off from whatever significance they ever have had. And trying to understand those belief systems is obviously never going to be easy. And this is just my sort of first attempt at things. And we'll see how we get on. And it was, as everybody knows, famously Covan, who really introduced the idea of a symbolic revolution, and his idea of the birth of gods stressed the importance of belief in the Neolithic, which grew in influence with Hodder's Çatalhöyük research project's investigation of the primary role of religion in settled life. An important point there, the settled life part as well. However, the focus of both of these projects was more on the nature of what a religion was, and to explain the huge increase in symbolism and material culture and their association with the practices of domestication. Neither became particularly engaged in what the beliefs held might actually be. And this absence is visible in discussions of modern dichotomies, right from the old Domos and Agrius back in the 1990s to the objective idea of thinginess. Our understanding of symbol and signifier, fundamental to the idea of a Neolithic revolution of symbols, is part of our own modern way of understanding the world. So my concern here is not what exactly the beliefs were that people may have held, but to develop an awareness that Neolithic belief and understanding of the world was likely to be profoundly different from our own. Now, rather than simply accept that Neolithic people had a different set of beliefs from ours, we need to remember that these beliefs didn't just overlie the same objective reality that we understand. They genuinely did see the world differently. Things aren't symbols that carry meanings, but were meanings in themselves. And if we regard so-called primitive belief systems as mistaken understandings of the world that we know as objective fact, we reduce them to symbolic overlays. And I'll argue that to try and understand the Neolithic, we've got to understand and remember that people lived in a very different world with very different beliefs about what they saw as reality. Now, Covan proposes the Neolithic, more specifically the PPNB, saw the birth of religion, meaning of high gods, as opposed to the animistic beliefs that characterize many small-scale societies. Yet high gods who are morally active in human affairs are part of a hierarchical view of the world, a status absent from most early Neolithic life. An egalitarian society would not have accepted the supernatural meddling and social constraints of deities who they saw as high rulers. Common to all models has been the understanding that farmers are in important ways like us. Covan famously directly compared them to French peasants. And Trevor Watkins, who's here, made the point that with the Neolithic, thus it may be said that the first people to be fully human, to share the humanity that is common to human societies in the world today, came into existence at the beginning of the Neolithic in Southwest Asia. And this in turn has been used by some to accentuate the modernity of the Neolithic, which in turn has allowed us to sidestep the differences that may exist and treat the Neolithic people as if they understood the world in the same way as we do. In direct contrast is the implicit or even explicit understanding that hunter-gatherers are different, not cognitively modern. And Trevor worked out that you need a cognitive revolution to allow them to cope with large group sizes living in sedentary communities that emerged at some point during the Neolithic. Which to me raises the question how such communities came together first if living in them required a cognitive revolution sparked by the stress of living in one. And Trevor has expanded his model here to account for this. But one of the problems that underlies this is the reductionist approach that generalizes across the globe and sees modern hunter-gatherers somehow as the same as hunter-gatherers 10,000 years ago and allows an analogy between the early Neolithic and the ethnographic present. And sometimes, in some interpretations and modeling, it seems more about identifying the present in the past than seeking to understand the past. Meanwhile, our understanding of farmers tends to be very limited and a poor reflection of the early Neolithic. The diversity of farmers in the recent and modern world should alert us to the fact that not all farmers are the same, and it's a very divergent group. Ethnographic analogy, of course, is used somewhat more when we're talking about hunter-gatherers than when we're talking about farmers, perhaps because of this issue where we identify farmers or accept farmers are more like us. So we don't need to use this medium of ethnographic analogy to approach their behavior. However, it remains vital for us to remember that we're looking at a period more than 10,000 years ago when we shouldn't really be thinking in terms of parallels with modern hunter-gatherers. Not only are they modern, but they've been in contact with the broad, wider world and have neighbours frequently who are farmers, and they've been neighbours for a long time, and many of them indeed were farmers before. It's a very different situation and rather a non-analogous situation, I always think, to the past when no farmers existed and people were leading highly dynamic existences which were making a transition that had never been undertaken before, never been seen before. So if we're looking or interested in the sorts of beliefs that Neolithic people may have held, we need to start somewhere, and animist beliefs, widespread in small-scale societies around the world, make some sort of starting point. Animism itself has a long history in anthropology, since the term was first introduced by Tyler in 1871 as an essential, original, but erroneous way of understanding the world. Animism reflects essential human cognitive mechanisms that understand things in terms of relationships, in kinship, with the distance in those relationships primarily defined by the ability to communicate rather than by biology. Animist ontologies in general are not concerned with differences between categories of life and non-life, but accept a category of being where many non-humans are accepted as people, with plants and animals also considered as kin. In such systems, the dead continue to act as persons. Given this sort of potential difference in how we and Neolithic people may have understood individuality, I'm now going to briefly cover a few issues. An important part of belief systems, perhaps especially when trying to interpret mortuary practices, is how persons and individuals are conceived of. As I just said, persons can include non-humans and include the dead. Animists and relational belief systems more generally tend not to distinguish a difference between intentional persons and unintentional things. Such worldviews are hard to reconcile with modern thought, with its dichotomy between subject and object rather than through relationships. Differences can go further. Strathern proposed the individual, a person constitutive of relationships. Such a person is composite, composed of social relations with others, and multiple features, for example, mind, soul, and body, which may have different origins and may not always be present in the body. They may be separated into parts and may not have simple boundaries. Such persons are given temporary shapes and identities by their context, whether it's task, an event, their perspective, and so on. These ideas of personhood are important to the archaeology of the Neolithic and the discussion of issues such as the growth of privacy, property, lineage, household, the maintenance of egalitarian systems, and the pressures of emergent differential wealth and hierarchy, all of which are related to our ideas of individuality. Where the individual has been discussed, it's been in social roles, such as the shaman or the ancestor, or in the difference between ascribed and attained status, as in discussions of burial practice and debate on the identification of specific individuals behind plaster masks, the importance of individual ancestors to household lineages, or how they acquired their status. These individuals are familiar to us from the modern concepts of the individual and the individual agent. Animist perspectives, where both plants and animals, as persons, have relationships with humans, do not fit within the modern perspective of farming as production. Such a modern perspective requires the presence of an individualized agent acting as the producer of what they produce. And this may be important for how we understand decision-making in the Neolithic. If the food being grown and hunted is made up of various degrees of kin, for us to analyze the process in terms of individual or corporate production of private property within systems of commodification may be seriously anachronistic. This has implications for our now widely accepted understanding of the PPNA as low-level production and the gradual emergence of private property and ownership. It's also been suggested that the domestication of animals begins to change them into property. If the Neolithic contains a shift from a kinship to a property relationship, we need to be aware that the changing relationship with animals, and equally plants, is not just an economic shift, nor even just a social process that alters their kinship status, but a change in how the world is seen. It's a change in belief. Domesticating animals ceases to be about the changing relations of production, the Marxist perspective which has dominated thought on the Neolithic since child, to the changing relationship between humans and non-humans. Strathern further proposed that clans or households can be constituted as a multiply constituted person, suppressing internal variation and emphasizing the collective. Coupled with the idea that persons can be divisible, this leads into a concept of fractal bodies, where the clan body may be composed of many people's bodies, with the clan as a fractal person. In a relational understanding of personhood, the collective person, an aspect of community, is where agency is expressed. So our modern concept of individuals as bounded entities possessing fixed innate character traits, as alienated from their world, engaged in relationships of capitalist possession towards the things, animals, and land, may not be appropriate for the Neolithic. Thomas and others have stressed that in most non-modern societies, persons and kinship are negotiated and take shape within social relations with other people, places, things, and tasks, making the nature of personhood contextual and shifting, and not determined by biology or genealogy. The purpose of constructing individuality is for the reconfiguration of social relationships, not the accumulation of wealth. In such fluid concepts of the person, the boundary between life and death need not be fixed. Bodies become social and communal objects, interrelated with other persons, or even animals and objects. In such contexts, experiences of the body and its relationship to the surrounding world differ vastly from our own experiences. Now, although these different ideas of personhood, are quite difficult for us to follow and accept, they may actually be something we can look for in burial practice. Some sort of animist belief system is implicit when people identify shaman in the Neolithic or preceding Natufian. However, simply identifying shaman or implying an animist type of belief system does not really advance our understanding of the past by itself. What we need to do, I'm arguing here, is to think about what an animist belief system might mean for the Neolithic. Given that one of our goals is to explain the processes of the Neolithic and the Neolithic of the origin of the Neolithic, we also need to think of where Neolithic belief systems come from. And rather than simply assume some sort of distant hunter-gatherer past where we were all the same, everybody was animist, and so on, we need to put this into some sort of historical context, which for us in Southwest Asia, of course, has to be developments in the Natufian. Very briefly running through this, Natufian burial practice includes examples of highly decorated individuals, some apparent multiple burials, and a focus on skulls. The grave goods generally become less common during the course of the Natufian, and they are entirely absent in the early Neolithic, not appearing again really until the end of the late PPNB, for example in recent discoveries at Badja. Early Neolithic burials are marked by their lack of decoration, possibly an indication of efforts to create and maintain a level of egalitarian society. But this appears to derive from a change of beliefs that occurred in the preceding Natufian during the course of the Natufian. The multiple burials of the Natufian, the mixed burials of the Natufian, are not quite what they seem. Fanny Bocquentin has argued that they are not all truly multiple mixed burials as we know from the Neolithic, but many are sequential single burials, perhaps suggesting a stronger sense of the importance of individuality than emerges in the Neolithic. But the presence of examples that appear more simultaneous in burial, and the commingling that happens immediately after sequential burials have taken place, suggests that some of the mingling of individual identities that we see in the Neolithic may already be occurring. The focus on skulls, identified from the Natufian into the Neolithic, has often been associated with ancestor worship, but that to some extent comes from a 19th century idea and is not really very likely. Worship of dead kin is not widespread amongst hunter-gatherers. A greater likelihood of active ancestor worship has been found in societies where important decisions are made by the kin group, as it's an important source of social control that strengthens cohesion amongst kin and maintains lineal control of power and property. And it appears that the more complex hunter-gatherer societies are more likely to have such ancestor worship, perhaps why we see it re-emerging in the late PPNB. And a reminder that egalitarian societies are always created and enforced to maintain their egalitarian qualities, which is perhaps why egalitarian behaviour appears in the early Neolithic and is not a constant of the ancient past. There's another line of development with the skulls that also appears in the Natufian, both at the early Natufian site of Azraq 18 and at Shebeka. I have to thank Andy Garrett for bringing my attention to the examples from Azraq 18. And here the skulls are defleshed and painted, probably in multiple episodes, with time passing in between the episodes, indicating that some remains were in active use after death and initial burial, a strong foreshadowing of early Neolithic practices. And the association of burial with early sedentarizing processes is not clear. Natufian settlements and Natufian burials and cemeteries are not always chronologically associated, or at least not always contemporary in their use. So I'm now going to move forward to consider the nature of early Neolithic settlement. And settlement's perhaps the best place for us to try to explore Neolithic daily practice, which is how we might again begin to see evidence for Neolithic belief systems at work. It's been assumed that as hunter-gatherer bands become complex, embodied religious ideas developed into a more articulated religion with a reliably transmitted narrative that justified a group's identity. Who we are, why we're here, and why we have a right to be here, creating a collective identity linked importantly to specific places and distinguishing communities one from another, seem to be increasingly important in a more permanently constructed and settled landscape. But again, we come back to the question, is fixed settlement an overstated idea for the early Neolithic, or indeed the idea that community equates to individual settlements? And we'll come back to those, particularly the idea of mobility. And if we look at the PPNA, in particular here in southern Jordan, it looks increasing, I think, as we work, that significant mobility probably continues in PPNA lives, and not just evident in the continued importance of hunting to their economies, but also in aspects like the size of sites. Few sites are sufficiently large for self-sustaining populations or to represent substantial permanent population aggregation. Cheryl Makarovitz has also argued that isotopic evidence from humans suggests that considerable mobility continues through the early Neolithic. Patterns of mobility go beyond simple subsistence-related expeditions, so we probably overstate this connection between burial and sedentism. It also means that in contrast to subsequent Neolithic periods when larger settlements appear, at this time, scalar stress is unlikely to have become a major issue. Only later, as sizes of settlement and populations and demographic intensity grow, did it become necessary to start to develop the solutions to such population stress. And I think we have to look at reasons for why people may have been held together in these communities when they begin to emerge, before, presumably, they had developed the solutions to living in such large accumulations. PPNA sites are all very variable. They vary one from another, and buildings within them vary considerably. It's not clear how many or whether or when residence was the main function of many of these settlements. For example, repeating houses as uniform and consistent elements are either invisible at sites like Fanan, where much of the architecture appears to have highly function-specific purposes, rare, as we found at Dra, where there were buildings for storage and for food processing and so on, and very few presumed to be residential houses, or indeed rather makeshift, as at sites like Netiv Hagdud, where in terms of house architecture, they're really amongst the least impressive buildings in the PPNA. The effective community may well have been geographically dispersed, each community existing as part of a wider network of settlement and landscape. And while people may have become more sedentary over time, the scale of their lives extended beyond these individual sites. And in terms of what I'm talking about today, this may start to reflect Strathern's fractal person, where individuality was not significant, but reflected the sort of complex network of life that we're building up. Architecture continues to develop and display diversity throughout the Neolithic of Jordan. And here we have the site of Beda near Petra, where importantly from the early excavations onwards, it was seen that this represented an evolution from round circular buildings through subcircular buildings to rectilinear pier houses. But increasing, it looks from both the radiocarbon dating evidence, which has been accumulated over time, and also things like the analysis of chipped stone recently completed by Pershevitz, that all of these changes in architecture happened really relatively rapidly, all encompassed within the middle PPNB. It's only in the late PPNB that we have the development of large houses where many of the functions of the community, which are prior to that shared around the settlement, are drawn into the house. Structures such as the famous Basta house. But even here with the large structures, the large houses, they're often still highly individual site to site. So if we turn now to these sorts of communal buildings that I've mentioned once or twice, particularly in the PPNA, communal architecture now appears ubiquitous and presumably important to the purpose of the settlements. Meeting places are vital as the arenas where people maintain their social ties, but also where they construct their worlds conceptually and also physically through their built environment. Social integrative spaces, such as dance houses, clan houses, and men's houses, are generalized, combining secular and ritual functions in small, politically simple societies. They only become more monumental and exclusively for ritual as community size increases. And ritual may give access to specifically charged social practices, reinforcing community identity. The behavioral and experiential components of religion with ritual and dance all create emotional states and reflect beliefs. Here at Beda, considerably more attention appears to be paid to the community building than to the apparently casual placing of the dead in an old structure that was filling up with rubbish. And the communal building here, as Cheryl and I reported, mostly appears like an outsized version of an ordinary domestic structure, but with this particularly sturdy floor. And the original interpretation of this stone floor, we now know was covered by a mud floor with gravel and so on. So a well constructed, multi-layered floor, strong enough to be used as something like a communal dance floor within the center of the community. In terms of our hypothesized belief systems, integrative facilities like this may have been vital to maintain the identities of fractal persons and their communities. Collective decision-making may be evident from the presence of communal architecture, and the fractal body of the collective, perceived through a relational belief system, may have been reinforced by an architectural framework that emphasized sharing in the community. Such sharing in community is emphasized in PPNA communal buildings. Everything we now know about the PPNA, and indeed much of the earlier part of the PPNB, is that social and economic life is all about community. This is in contrast to ideas that private property emerged as part of the Neolithic as a result of the investment of labor in food production. As with egalitarianism, people at the time seem to have been very resistant to these potential developments. And within the PPNA, there appear to be a number of simple measures taken to encourage community action and sharing of resources. For example, the construction of external food storage and food processing structures. These are not only shared, but publicly shared. Using them, adding and removing goods, is fully public and easily observable, which could have served to enforce obligatory sharing by creating an open environment that allows social monitoring of the adherence to social rules expected of members of community. But perhaps if we think of belief systems, it's not about social enforcement, but a reflection of the underlying beliefs that guided social behavior. Unlike the cognitive and social mechanisms argued to be responses to demographic pressure in the later Neolithic, these communal buildings, increasingly appearing as a common feature of PPNA sites, seem to reflect a very PPNA mode of looking at the world that spreads rapidly through the PPNA in advance of the emergence of the multi-hectare sites of the late PPNB and beyond. and in advance of the appearance of domestic plants or the early stages of animal domestication. They appear to flourish and spread remarkably rapidly, perhaps from Natufian forebears in the southern Levant, such as Malacha or Wadi Hema 27, and in the PPNA are evident from WF16 in southern Jordan to Nemrek in northern Iraq. Their distribution is largely the same as the El Qaim point, which may have served as a common element of material culture that provided a link over a wide but loose network. The communal buildings are highly diverse in form and scale as well as apparent function. While some may be closely associated with emerging new subsistence practices, such as the storage features found in communal buildings at Dra, W16 or Jaffa, amongst others, other communal buildings, such as the T-shaped pillar buildings of Göbekli Tepe, have no such simple economic correlation. Intriguingly, it may be this relational belief system, with its lack of focus on the individual, but a concentration on the community, that supports the adoption of a new subsistence strategy, one that increasingly relied on a decreasing range of highly seasonal harvests made possible only through the collective management of labour and storage. The networks established through degrees of kinship and expressed in common material culture could have ensured the rapid dispersal of new ideas and practices. The architecture of the Natufian, we go back a bit to our origins, for example at Malaha or Wadi Hema, includes examples of large structures, some with benches. The bench structure at Malaha may have additional significance from its placement over a multiple burial. Shabeka in northern Jordan, with excavations recently by Tobias Richter and colleagues, is remarkably impressive, being well made with stone walls and floors, with built-in features such as hearths. These mark a very sharp break with simple functional shelters of the earlier Epipaleolithic, composed of shallow scoops and brushwood walls. Why does this Natufian architecture suddenly appear? Interpretations that it's simply a consequence of greater sedentism have already been widely critiqued, and perhaps it's about creating special buildings, representing an ideological shift that required a more permanent marking of the landscape. If so, this might indicate that here is the change in belief systems that, in Kovan's model, goes on to permit the Neolithic, that lets people start to overtly manipulate the world. The large structure at W16, which I showed you one of the reconstructions of earlier, is remarkably symmetrical once the later structure at the bottom is removed, which I've done partly here by putting up part of the face of one of the bench tiers. Such symmetry suggests greater formality to the communal displays that we assume were conducted here. Steve Myton has relatively recently suggested that W16 may have played an important role in shamanistic practice. Myself, I often worry a little bit about the generic application of shaman to the Neolithic in my querying of the appropriateness of some analogies to these very specific past practices. But whatever, it appears clear that this structure, comprising a large proportion of the site, represents a significant communal effort and has a communal function. Again, we seem to be seeing a reflection in an understanding of the community as a collective, with the internal divisions in the structure possibly a reflection of the fractal nature of such an identity. We can go on from communal structures generally seen as having pragmatic quotidian functions to structures that appear to have a predominantly ritual purpose. The large building at Finlayson seems to bridge these with its mortars present in the floor, suggesting that people were actually doing functional activities in the middle. And then we move on to buildings that appear to have no utilitarian everyday function. The stone tower at Jericho, initially seen as defensive, has been interpreted in more magical or ritual ways, and various interpretations have come up over time. The presence of storage structures at space and the association of burials again seems to emphasize a role for this structure in collective values, shared resources, and the specific role of dead people within that. Just as a reminder of changes beyond the Levant, the subject of this series of talks, recent spectacular finds, such as the carved stones at Göbekli Tepe, have continued to highlight the significance of symbolic life and are associated with an economy that on the whole remains typical of the PPNA, with its emphasis on wild resources and hunting rather than farming. As more sites have been identified in the region, such as Karahan Tepe, their role as central places becomes less plausible. Meanwhile, back at Beda, the shrine complex, part of the middle PPMB flourishing of the site, seems fairly certain to have had an integrative role. It's located just outside the settlement, and it represents a more overt religious structure than the communal building we looked at before, with upright stones, distinctive floors, and a large basin outside. Its separation from the main settlement suggests that this complex may have played quite a distinct role in ritual activity, with intentional separation being important. This apparent separation of religious structure from domestic space suggests that a gap may have been beginning to grow between sacred and secular domains at this time, and this complex clearly foreshadows the Ain Ghazal late PPMB religious structures. At Ain Ghazal, various structures have been interpreted as cultic, including this large one described as a temple, with the altar at the back and separated from the surrounding settlement by the large wall that runs around it. The interior space is highly partitioned. Not only does that mean that you can no longer get many people inside, it's no longer for sharing. It's cut off and the spaces are partitioned. Now, not all ritual activity is associated with settlements, even as the PPN proceeds and large residential settlements appear. The ritual objects in the Nahal Mar cave are located at a remote desert location. Other examples of locations used for ritual practice include Kfar HaHaresh, seemingly a ritual site, or at least in part a ritual site, distanced from the normal residential sites. Kfar HaHaresh is also, and important to some of the things I've been talking about tonight, or this afternoon, known for its mixing of human and animal bones, possibly an indication that here at least, not only the dead, but animals too could be persons. So with that, I'm finally going to turn to mortuary practice, where a markedly different set of practices characterizes both the Natufian, a markedly diverse set of practices characterize both the Natufian and the early Neolithic. At PPNA W16, the dead are all around, even in the floor and the walls, present to the living. There's no separation of living from dead in the early Neolithic. As Goring Morris has commented, this is a specifically early Neolithic characteristic, where the mingling of dead inside the residential site or the settlement as a whole is comprehensive. At W16, their visibility is assured. Some skulls associated with other remains protrude through the floor as if to mark the locations of the underlying burials, but very visible on a daily basis. There are different types of burial at both W16 and Dra. This sleeping position is quite common. And one of the questions is, are these simply people who've been buried and nobody has yet gone back to them? Or is there something markedly different about people who are sleeping and no longer so active in the community? Can they be woken up? Or is there a phase of rest when you're first buried and defleshing? Painted skulls, as you can see on the bottom corner, and as I said, a tradition starting in the Natufian, clearly applied after defleshing, and perhaps a predecessor of plastering, but very definitely an indicator that people were manipulating bones and doing things to them after they'd been buried and defleshed. These remains, with the visible skulls, the digging up of bones, the moving of bones and painting of bones, these dead bodies are definitely playing an active role in daily practice. And the ubiquitous presence and moving and mixing of bones is a reminder of relational beliefs of personhood. The dead, as I say, are still present and active. Individuality is not important. There's an awful lot of mixing of bones that's happening. Indeed, only the passive sleepers are present as single inhumations. And perhaps the wrapping of bones in bags, visible here with the gypsum lining that has preserved the pattern of the bag, is an important feature of how these bones were moved and carried about, which we'll come back to. And here Again, at WF16, there appears to have been a disturbance of initial burial with the removal and addition of bones, finally completed with the placement of a small cache of skull caps. So it's not just the movement of bones. There are bones that are selected as being of particular interest, bones that are brought back together, and multiple individuals brought back. This is not simply what Fanny Beaucantin has talked about in the Tufian of sequential burial. This is very much, although it's happening over an extended period of time, a process that's affecting the earlier burials and deliberately mixing them up. Now, as presented by Cheryl McCarretts and I in the online Neolithic seminars that were run during COVID, PPNA mortuary practice can extend beyond the single site and encompass a wider landscape. In the case of Sharara, the site location appears to have had little to do with subsistence, suggesting the remote and difficult landscape may have been chosen more for those qualities in themselves. And within the site, we found an extensive plaster floor, beneath which there were a number of burials. And unlike elsewhere, where I've talked about the diversity of burial, here the burials are nearly all very much the same. They all end with what looks like a bag of mixed bones being dumped on top of the other remains in a kist. And these are highly disorganized, mixed up remains of human beings, presumably brought up in a bag. But they were dumped in turn on carefully placed skulls and long bones. Carefully placed, but unlike the later plastered skulls, not on display. If you see how closely they're jammed up against them, and indeed some of them are fragmentary, they're clearly defleshed. A male and a female in some of them suggests a probably fictive kinship or a procreative unit. But it's not limited to that, as other individuals are also represented in the fragmented bones. It's, in terms of our relational belief system, it's the community, not the individual, that's important in these burials. And this Neolithic secondary burial practice may again confirm the way that a multiple burial could still be a person. A skull may be a fractal part, and fractal burials encapsulate the wider community. Where personal identity is not important, far from skulls representing individual ancestors, secondary burial and disarticulation may de-individualize. Rather than the symbolic representation of ancestors and past lineages, these burials are active members of the community, effective kin. Multiple bodies placed within burials represent the ongoing social person and not the skin-bound body of an individual living people. The mixed-up bones of multiple skeletons and collective skulls is not about anonymizing individuals, but reflects the fractal collective identity, forms of personhood that were not bounded and individuated. What's been interpreted as the collapsing of identity through the process of secondary burial, or in the PPNB, through the masking of individuals created by mandible removal and plaster remodeling of faces, may more simply just reflect a concept of personhood that does not recognize individuals as we do. Mortuary practice is frequently interpreted as negotiating relationships between the living and the dead. However, if through the window of alternative belief systems, we recognize the possibility that the dead are also persons, then mortuary practices may be better interpreted as facilitating ongoing relationships. If the dead continue as persons within alternate belief systems, then dying is not an end, but a transformation, and the social existence of a person may continue after biological death. In contrast with the modern constant individual, the social being in a relational belief system can transform and its individual parts be reconfigured in a new relationship. The nature of those relationships within the community can continue to change through the context of events and ritual actions. Now, Cheryl and I have obviously debated a lot about the function of the channel that leads underground to the burials, and it appears at least plausible that it provided a route to continue to stay in touch with the dead, here perhaps finally removed from their everyday contexts. Perhaps here at last they're at rest, but still available as a community of elders. There's even one possible Natufian example for contact with the dead being physically assisted, at Nahl-Aren, where Stakalis and Noy recorded breached grinding stones protruding above the surface of burials, which I think Nigel Goring-Morris likened to speaking tubes linking the living to the dead. Now, at Cheryl's excavations at El Hema, at the end of the PPNA, individual complete burials were found in sitting positions, plaster poured in, sticking feet in place, no longer mobile, and definitely much more individual than what we've seen before. So perhaps we see then the start of separation of living from dead, and the evidence for ritual architecture grows in the middle PPNB, as shown before in the form of the little shrine outside Beda. And here at Shkaret Mazed, a large central building appears to echo this and to fulfill the special mortuary role right at the heart of the community. Now, although absent from southern Jordan, the focus on skulls reaches a peak with plastering and the production of figurines in the middle PPNB. While some may look like life models, others do not. Variation in whether the mandible is included in the plastered skull or not shows variation in modelling, but in general it seems unlikely that plastered skulls were intended to look like their living selves. Individual identity is not important. And the skulls are often found in multiples. Ian Kiter suggests that there may have been significance in the numbers of skulls found cached together, referring in particular to the multiples of 3 that they occur in. And here again, we might be able to see a representation of a fractal personhood, one perhaps that with the multiples of 3 removes itself clearly from the fictive relationships that we might be able to see at Sharara. These skulls appear designed for display, for a while part of life again, and Goring Morris has proposed that this may represent some form of reincarnation. If the dead are present in the community, perhaps reincarnation is not actually needed. However, this plastering process really starts after the egalitarian sharing systems of the PPNA seem to be reducing in strength. The effort put into the plastering, analysed in detail at Kfar HaHaresh, suggests a new urgency to their treatment. Along with the growth of mortuaries, perhaps this reflects changes in belief systems beginning to emerge. Now, to sum up and try and put this together, I think the important features of this start off with individuality not being strong, and these communal or fractal identities can be seen both in life and in death, both in the shared buildings, the communal activities, the emphasis on sharing, and also in death and the multiple burials. Importantly, being dead does not end activity. Human remains were moved, rearranged, and sometimes displayed. Skulls were painted from the Natufian onwards and plastered in the middle PPNB, all before the stresses of large PPNB population centres emerge. Sharing and public storage seen in the PPNA reflects a belief system. It's not just economic, social behaviour, it's pervasive throughout their lives and deaths. Collective identity, the basis for community, continues beyond the PPNA and provides the glue that holds PPNB large settlements together beyond what may have made sense economically and which required increasing social efforts to maintain, but notably efforts that arise after the settlements have begun to develop. I think we can also see, running from the Natufian, a clear historical trajectory, possible signs of individuality beginning to emerge in the middle PPNB, and by the end of the late PPNB, the return of the individualized burial. The collective beliefs of the early Neolithic may be seen in decline with the ritual structures of Ein Ghazal, and perhaps also with the grave goods of late PPNB Badger. Back to Kovan's idea of major religious change, but now at the end rather than the start of the late PPNB. And with those changes, the forces that held Neolithic settlements together began to decline, and in turn, the early Neolithic settlement pattern comes to an end. Trying to frame our research and interpretation in a way that recognizes the high probability that we're dealing with societies with markedly differing belief systems and ways of understanding the world from our own represents a major challenge, I think not just disciplinary, but individually too. Our existing discussion in the Neolithic is full of modern references, and we can't escape them, including all these homely and comforting terminologies: hamlet, village, farming, and household. They serve to tame the Neolithic and make it familiar. So it's not just in analogy that we try and make the world familiar, but in this whole language that we use to describe it. Perspectives from alternate belief systems may, in contrast, be rather difficult to understand and incompatible with our modern conceptions. However, they're essential if we seek to understand the processes of change in a Neolithic that we recognise is different from the present. Rather than simply assuming people were like us, or perhaps were becoming like us, the forms of personhood need to be a target for our research. In a world where things may have been people, and people were constituted by their relationships, Applying a modernist belief system where persons and objects are thing-like and to suggest increasing materiality and thinginess in the Neolithic may be to miss the point. Thank you.